The rich have been getting richer during COVID-19, and this is definitely something we need to, be focused on and, you know, at least questioning whether or not that's something that is a problem that needs to be dealt with. So essentially, again, we're looking at, the highest unemployment number in decades. Large businesses have been benefiting like much more than small businesses. And those small businesses are hurting the most, especially in the travel, service, retail. They're getting hurt the most, while companies that are able to, essentially the, quote unquote work from home economy, are benefiting massively, like Amazon, Zoom, and so on. Even more so, the employees of these companies are being forced to work in, quote, like riskier conditions with no pay increase. And that's something that's a real big issue, especially when you look at, say, Amazon. And don't get me wrong, like I'm not, we all use Amazon, right? I use Amazon, but we do need to keep in mind that there are serious issues that are going on right now, because Amazon is definitely benefiting astronomically compared to other companies. And at the same time, during this, when they're having more volume, workers are having to do more, they're not paying them more. And on top of that, they're not allowing them to unionize. Like, they have been actively pushing down unionization at Amazon during a pandemic, while those employees are working in warehouses in close proximity, touching thousands of packages a night. And, this is a real issue we need to consider as a country, of what are we, going to do about this. I know for me, in college, I worked for 5 years at UPS as a package handler. And I know that I can't, I know people that still work there. I talk to them pretty regularly, and it's crazy. Like, it's crazy what they're having to deal with right now, because while a lot of us are in situations where, like, we have a little bit more laid back lifestyle, we're at home more, or hours are being cut at different places, which all have negatives as well. These people are working more and not getting paid more for it, and while their companies are disproportionately benefiting. And that's, yeah, definitely something to keep in mind. And those that have been deemed essential employees, regardless of industry, are the most economically at risk on top of that. So they have the most at risk, both medically, because they're the most, they're coming in contact with people more. They have more chances of ending up having a medical, issue that they will end up having to pay for. But they're also doing that because of the economic pressure that they feel to work those jobs, even when the conditions are not, at the best that they, should be. This is definitely something that is, that in my opinion, we need to have reform to try and fix. And then when you consider that increased medical cost due to higher rates of transmission, because obviously there's more people that are going to have, medical costs this year than there have been in other years, based on the fact that there are more people getting sick. And then on top of that, you have, adding insult to injury, you have America's billionaires that have increased their wealth by around 650 billion since the pandemic. Now, as far as the start of the pandemic and where they're measuring that line, and again, I will post articles below, but where they're measuring that line, I do think that there is a discussion around that, and I'll cover that later, about whether or not that's a truly fair comparison. But the reality is that we do need to, at least question what's going on. And so, similar to the payroll tax deferral, another policy that has been proposed is the Make Billionaires Pay Act. And this was introduced in the Senate by Bernie Sanders, Ed Markey, and Kirsten Gillibrand. And this was the proposal was to impose a 60% wealth tax on gains made by billionaires between March 18th, 2020 and January 1st, 2021, and then using those funds to fund out-of-pocket healthcare expenses for all Americans. Now, like the payroll tax deferral, while I think that this is definitely something that should be on the, like a wealth tax should be discussed on the table, given the increasing wealth gap. I do think that this is a little bit similar to the payroll tax deferral in that it's not going to pass. It's not going to pass in a GOP controlled Senate. And also, I think that starting it at March 18th is kind of disingenuous. I think that you have to, because when you look, let's look at a chart real quick and I'll show you what I'm talking about. But basically, the pandemic obviously started before March 18th, but that was when the government had fully acknowledged that, it was something that we had to deal with. But basically, let's look real quick on here. Let me show you guys what I'm doing. So basically, when we're looking at this S&P 500 chart, so I'm just going to use that for the market as a whole. Right here, is March 23rd. That was the bottom of the market day. Remember it very well. And because I was buying a ton. And March 18th, right here, March 11th, I believe, was the first day where Trump actually called it a pandemic on TV. But March 18th was when they were doing this line of demarcation. In my personal opinion, I think that late February would be a much more fair assessment of when the pandemic started, because that was when you started to see this first slide in the economy. And that was definitely from COVID. I know that for me, as an example, I was buying right here in like late January. I was buying a bunch of like 2 and 3x inverse ETFs on semiconductor and tech stocks, because it was very obvious that these economic changes that were happening, even if they didn't come to the U.S. and China, happening in China when most of our economy is driven by FANG stocks. Those FANG stocks are getting most of their equipment, like semiconductors, from China, Taiwan, Korea. It was very obvious that we were going to have a downturn, and I think that would be much more fair. So again, I think there's a little bit of political posturing going on with this, but it's something to keep in mind, at least as far as discussion. And I think that's something that'll definitely be brought up within the discussions in Congress and on the Senate floor. Those will definitely come up. People are going to question it because it seems fairly evident to me. And a lot of wealth gained has been in stock appreciation and is not liquid. That's the other real big pushback that people have on this. I know I saw Andrew Ross Sorkin and others on CNBC talking about this, saying that Bezos, as an example, how are you going to tax him 60% on his wealth increase when most of that is in stocks? Well, if you're someone who's struggling right now, I think your answer, you don't really lose sleep over saying that he should sell those stocks and give more to people. But it is definitely something to keep in mind, because obviously that's going to affect Amazon stockholders as well. And I don't see people in Congress that, likely do hold a lot of stock in Amazon and otherwise hurting their own pockets by, forcing that. That being said, I do think that having a wealth tax is a good idea in principle, especially in contrast with our social safety net relative to other countries worldwide. I just think there's a couple hangups in this bill that will end up keeping it from getting passed. And I think we need to reform and enforce employees owning / being compensated with more stock. And less being held by the CEO. I think we should put in reforms for, say, X% of companies, like X% of a company, like say 75% of a company or 50% of a company should be owned by the employees. And what I mean by that is that employees are owning, they have ownership stake, they have stock. I think that allowing CEOs to mostly be compensated in stock is a really bad thing for the average person. And I think this is really obvious, especially when you look at, say, airlines. And right now, the contrast, because, airline employees are getting hurt really badly right now. And their CEOs are mostly paid with stock. Well, guess what? After the 2008 financial crisis, whenever we bailed out the airlines the last time, the airlines have been the number one buyers of their own stock since then through this process known as stock buybacks. And so stock buybacks are essentially where a company is able to buy shares of its stock. And in principle, this is used when the company thinks that their stock is cheap. They would buy it. That would end up increasing the price of the stock because more people are buying. And therefore, they make money off of that appreciation. And the issue here is that this benefits the people that are the executive suite at those companies because they're essentially raising their own stake in the company with company money, when they could instead use that to give, say, either shares of stock back to their employees as a bonus or give their employees money. But instead, what you've been seeing is that when you have these cyclical downturns, whether in 2001, 2008 financial crisis, or COVID, you see these downturns, and then what do? They cut, they cut the amount that they'll pay, they cut routes, so they cut hours, and then they furlough / fire people. And this is a real problem that I think was a really big issue with the bailout bill as well, is we needed to put more restrictions on stock buybacks because it's a negative incentive for companies to it's a negative incentive for companies. It gives them, it incentivizes them to not do what's in the best interest of their employees and to instead just keep pumping up the valuation of their company, which essentially also is showing artificial growth. Because the reality is airlines, like I was saying earlier, are more like a public utility now than any other time in history because we're increasingly more globally interconnected. So there's just not much that they can increase on, like from a, strategic standpoint. There's not that much difference between what one airline is going to be able to do versus another airline within the US economy. And if you've ever traveled internationally, specifically if you've traveled on, say, like Emirates versus American Airlines, you'll definitely see this because those companies, especially in the UAE and a lot of airlines worldwide, I know Korean Air is the same way. They are actually publicly owned. So what that means is that they don't have profit motives. And that ends up, that ends up giving more value to the people flying on them because they don't have to make money off of it. So you take away however much % profit they would be making and put that back into the company, and it's a better service for those people. And I think that's something that we should look at because, as an example, like I said earlier about my father and brother both being pilots, when you look at, say, a person who wants to go and fly for Emirates, they get paid way more than people, that work for American private airlines. And it's definitely a thing to think about. So anyway, and then I do think we need, like I said, to add some type of wealth tax or higher income tax. Like I said, this goes back to the contractionary fiscal policies that I think we need in times like right now versus the expansionary fiscal policies. I think we have to do that, and at least do it as like an incentive. Like, say, you have a company that has, quote, that defines certain workers as essential. I think that we should put a restriction on those companies to either have a higher minimum wage for those workers, or I think that we should have, tax credits for companies that do meet a certain standard and tax companies that don't more heavily, because we need to do something to incentivize them to not, take advantage of their own employees, when they're doing well. And then I think we should do the same with companies that push against unions and workers' rights. I think that those companies should not be allowed to benefit if their workers are not also benefiting at the same time. I think we need, to do something about that. And while I think that the Make Billionaires Pay Act is not I think it's mostly political posturing, same as the payroll tax deferral. While I think it's not necessarily going to be effective, I do think that there are some decent ideas within it that we may be able to think about in the future. If you enjoyed this clip, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out the full live version of the Wealth for 99 podcast, where we talk finance, economics, and public policy from a working class perspective. We'll see you there.